Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BC. There are moments in history when time seems to hold its breath, when thousands of lives hang in the balance of a single decision, and when empires tremble, not under the weight of catapults or cavalry, but from the fierce conviction of a single will. This was one of those moments. It was just before dawn, near a dusty, windswept plain not far from modern-day Mosul in northern Iraq. The stars still lingered in the black bruised sky. Campfires crackled low. Men muttered ancient prayers into their hands, kissed tokens from home, or stared blankly at the horizon, waiting. What they were waiting for was the collision of two worlds. To the east, King Darius III of Persia, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known. From the shores of the Indus to the Mediterranean, he commanded cities, soldiers, slaves. His power was immense. And to the west, a man not yet 30. A man who had crossed mountains and deserts with a hunger that knew no rest. A man whose name would echo through eternity. Alexander, son of Philip, king of Macedon, lord of conquest. And on this October morning in 331 BC, he had come for an empire. The Persian host had gathered on the plains of Gaugamela, chosen by Darius himself. A vast, flat killing field, ideal for his scythed chariots and sweeping cavalry. His engineers had even levelled the terrain, removing boulders, filling in ditches, so that nothing would disrupt the charge. He wanted it clean, predictable, controlled. He was preparing for victory, but what he got was Alexander. Darius had numbers, possibly 200,000 men, maybe more. A wall of humanity. Infantry from Bactria, archers from Media, Indian war elephants with armoured foreheads, chariots fitted with blades to hack at legs and horses alike. His elite cavalry were Persian nobles, well armoured, fast and deadly. The Immortals, his famous guard, stood ready. And he had the high ground in pride. This was his land, his empire, and he had no intention of giving it up to a foreign upstart. But Alexander had something else. He had clarity. While the Persians moved with grandeur, Alexander moved with purpose. At his back were 40,000 infantry, tough, professional, disciplined. Macedonian phalangites held their sarissas, long wicked spears that reached 18 feet in length, like living bristled walls. And at his side rode the Companion Cavalry, noblemen turned killers, trained to charge with deadly force and pivot with uncanny discipline. Most of them had followed him for years. Some had grown up with him. They'd bled in the mountains of Asia Minor, thirsted across Syrian sands, and now stood again on the cusp of annihilation or triumph. And Alexander was ready. The night before the battle, he slept. Not restlessly, not in dread, but deeply. Ptolemy, his companion and future historian, would later remark on it, that while Darius's camp bustled with omens and astrologers, Alexander lay still, wrapped in his cloak. He didn't fear the morning, he invited it. At first light he addressed his men. No speech survives word for word, but echoes remain, of promises of glory, reminders of victories past, and the immortal claim. The prize is the world. And then he mounted Bucephalus, his black battle-scarred stallion, and led them forward. Picture it now, a plain shimmering under the rising sun, the glint of bronze and steel like waves on water, the distant roll of hooves, the rattling wheels of chariots, and above it all, the thunder in every chest. The Macedonians deployed in a single line, with Alexander himself commanding the right flank. But even as they moved, the Persian numbers stretched far wider, a crescent of men, horses, and iron designed to engulf them. It looked suicidal. And that was the trap. Alexander didn't fight by the book. He fought by instinct, by deception, and by the raw, sharpened edge of timing. He advanced diagonally, refusing the left flank, extending the right, drawing the Persian left further out, thinning their centre. It was elegant, mathematical, predatory. Darius, watching from his chariot, realized something was wrong. His line wasn't folding the Macedonians in. It was overextending, and Alexander was aiming for him. The Persian scythed chariots thundered into motion, a terrifying sight. Long, low carriages with whirring blades protruding from the axles, designed to cut men and horses to ribbons. But Alexander had prepared. As they charged, he gave the order, "Part ranks." The phalangites stepped aside, like doors opening in a corridor. The chariots thundered through empty lanes, their speed uncontrollable, only to be cut down from the sides by javelins, spears, and heavy shields. It was not chaos. It was orchestration. Then came the real assault. Alexander saw the moment the centre of the Persian line, loosened, stretched, was vulnerable. He turned to his companion cavalry. No war cries, no theatrics, just a nod. And then they charged. It was like lightning striking earth, steel and muscle and man as one. The Persian line bucked, cracked. Alexander drove directly toward Darius's chariot, cutting down guards as he went. The Persian king panicked, turned and fled. That single moment, the retreat of the great king, became legend. Because when a king runs, an army breaks. But the battle wasn't over. Far from it, the Persian right, led by Bessus, a satrap and cousin of Darius, drove deep into the Macedonian left. Panic flared. For a moment, the Macedonian camp was even threatened, with baggage handlers, wounded, and non-combatants under attack. But Parmenion, Alexander's trusted general, held firm, sent for reinforcements. And in a brutal melee, the tide turned again. Everywhere across the plain, men died, some crushed under horses, some pierced by spears, some lost in the dust and blood and screamed their last unheard. But slowly, surely, the Persian army dissolved. There was no order, no command, just flight and death. And when the sun finally began to sink, the Battle of Gaugamela was over. Alexander had won, but victory came with a toll. The field was a graveyard. Bodies, horses and men alike, strewn like broken dolls. The acrid sting of sweat, blood and death hung thick. Buzzards circled. Survivors wept, some from pain, some from disbelief. And in the silence, only the wind moved freely. Darius escaped for now, but his empire was broken. The road to Babylon lay open. The treasuries of Persia would soon be in Macedonian hands. And Alexander, just 25 years old, was now the master of Asia. The world would never be the same again. But this was only the beginning, because what Alexander saw was not an ending. It was a gateway to the unknown, to the edge of the world, to glory or madness. And he would walk through that gate with fire in his eyes. The Persian host was in ruin, but Alexander wasn't done. The dust hadn't even settled before he was in the saddle again, eyes fixed to the east. Somewhere out there, among the shattered remnants of an empire, Darius was fleeing, alive, wounded perhaps, in pride, if not in flesh, but alive. Alexander didn't want a ghost story. He wanted closure. And so the pursuit began. He left a portion of his army behind, to gather the wounded and bury the dead, a grim, reverent task, while he took a mounted force and thundered across the Mesopotamian plains in pursuit of the vanishing king. They rode hard, day and night, through villages still bearing the banners of Persia, through hills where locals offered food and whispered rumours, through cold desert nights where campfires flickered low and men dreamed of home. But Darius was always one step ahead, fleeing deeper into the east, toward the ancient lands of Media and Bactria, toward the ragged edge of the known world. And behind him his empire collapsed. One by one, the cities opened their gates. Babylon, the jewel of the East, surrendered without a fight. Its priests and nobles met Alexander with gifts and obeisance. They laid before him their golden idols, their chests of coin, their histories written in cuneiform on clay. He walked through its streets in silence, a foreign conqueror being hailed as a divine liberator. To some he was a destroyer, to others a god in human skin. At Susa, the treasures of Persia dazzled even the hardened Macedonian veterans, gold by the ton, jewels, silks, spices. But it wasn't just the wealth. It was the weight of history. These were cities older than Athens, older than Rome, cradles of civilization. And now their thrones bore Alexander's name. He was no longer just a king. He was becoming something else. And yet, through it all, his thoughts kept circling back to one thing. Darius, still alive, still out there, still a threat. So Alexander marched east again, past Susa, past the Zagros Mountains, through the Elburz foothills, and into the heart of Persia itself. To Persepolis. Ah, Persepolis, a city carved into stone, terraces of palaces and audience halls, towering columns that touched the heavens, reliefs of warriors, servants, offerings, all paying tribute to the Persian kings who had ruled for centuries. And above it all, on the great staircase, lions devouring bulls, carved in cold, immortal silence. But now it was his. The Macedonians entered cautiously. No resistance, no defiance. And there, inside the royal treasury, they found what no soldier expected. Wealth beyond reason. 200,000 talents of gold and silver, by some accounts, hoarded in chambers sealed for generations. It was more than loot. It was the bloodstream of empire. And Alexander took it all. But then, in one of the most debated decisions of his life, he ordered Persepolis to be burned. The palace of Xerxes, the hall of kings, torched, flames rising into the black night, smoke curling like a funeral veil. Some said it was revenge for the Persian sack of Athens long ago. Some said it was symbolic, a gesture to say the old world is dead, a new one begins. And some said it was a drunken mistake, that it happened during a revel, that a courtesan named Thais urged him to do it, and in the haze of wine and pride, he agreed. No one knows for sure. But when the fire died, so too did Persia's soul. Still, Darius lived. By now he had lost everything but his name. His army had melted into local militias. His court was scattered. He was a fugitive in his own lands, relying on the loyalty of a few remaining satraps. And one of those was Bessus, a cousin, a commander at Gaugamela, and a man who had already begun dreaming of a crown. As Alexander closed in, riding like a storm through the highlands of Ecbatana, Bessus made his move. Darius was seized, shackled, and then somewhere on the road through the Bactrian borderlands, he was stabbed, left to die in a wagon, abandoned by those he once ruled. Alexander's scouts found him, barely alive, bleeding, surrounded by silence. He died before Alexander could arrive. The moment he heard, Alexander went to the body, He ordered it wrapped in royal cloth, treated with honour, sent back to Persepolis for burial with the dignity of a king. This wasn't showmanship, it was respect, because Alexander, for all his ambition, understood what Darius had once been. A ruler of nations, a son of empire, and a man who had stood against the tide. But now the old order was gone, and Alexander, at just 26, was emperor of Greece, of Egypt, of Persia. The map no longer held boundaries, only possibilities. Yet something had changed. Victory no longer sated him. The conquests had become more than just political, more than military. They were personal, an obsession. Some of his men saw it early. The way he wore Persian robes, the way he adopted Eastern customs, the way he expected worship, not just loyalty. He claimed to be the son of Zeus Ammon now, a demigod. To some it was heresy, to others destiny. He began to lose old friends. Parmenion, his oldest general, executed on suspicion of conspiracy. Philotas, the general's son, accused of treason and killed. The circle of trust tightened. The boy who had once wept at Homer's verses now sat among courtiers who whispered in foreign tongues. But Alexander didn't care. He was already looking east, toward India, toward the edge of the earth, because somewhere out there were new kingdoms, new gods, new enemies, and a deeper meaning. Gaugamela hadn't just crushed Persia. It had unleashed something, a hunger no longer bounded by geography or reason, and so the army marched, over rivers and through jungles, into battles with kings they'd never heard of, in lands they couldn't pronounce. Every step, further from home. Every battle, bloodier. Every victory, lonelier. But still he pressed on. The shadow of Gaugamela stretched far behind him, and the road ahead was shrouded in myth, madness and mortality. He was no longer a man chasing an empire. He was the empire. From the scorched gates of Persepolis to the fetid jungles of India, Alexander pressed forward, no longer for glory, not for gold, not even for revenge, but because he could not stop. The army followed, though many no longer knew why. They crossed the Hindu Kush, freezing and gasping at altitudes that broke beasts and men alike. They reached the Indus Valley, green, strange, dense with life. Here, the air was thick with insects and foreign gods. The trees whispered in tongues older than Macedon. The rivers ran wide and treacherous, and waiting for them was Porus, an Indian king, tall, proud, and unwilling to kneel. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, he met Alexander in a downpour, with war elephants pounding the earth like ancient drums, their tusks sharpened, their hides armoured, and their riders wielding cruel hooks and lances. It was like facing monsters. The Macedonians had never seen such a thing. Their horses panicked. Men broke ranks. But Alexander rallied them, with flares of rage, courage, and unyielding presence. He used the terrain, crossed the river at night, struck the flank, and once again he won. But even in victory he showed grace. He did not humiliate Porus. He made him an ally, a governor, because Alexander didn't just conquer people, he absorbed them. But for the first time his men began to resist. They were exhausted. No more dreams of home, only the ache of endless marching, the rot of tropical wounds, the blur of dead faces. When he asked them to press further east, to push toward the Ganges and whatever lay beyond, they refused, not with rebellion, but with silence. They simply stopped. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander stood alone, soaked in the rising sun, a king, a god, and a man, staring east and finding no one behind him. So he turned back. The retreat through the Gedrosian desert was perhaps his most bitter campaign, not against men, But nature, sandstorms, heat, starvation, dehydration so fierce it cracked lips into bleeding masks and left men drinking their own urine to survive. Some estimate he lost more soldiers crossing that wasteland than he did at Gaugamela. And for what? Even he began to wonder. When he finally returned to Babylon, now the unofficial capital of his empire, he was changed. Worn thinner, eyes darker, still charismatic, still commanding, but heavier in soul. He tried to govern, to unify. He arranged marriages between Macedonians and Persian noblewomen, forging a new blended aristocracy. He drafted plans for new roads, new cities, new harbours. But the cracks were beginning to show. Old wounds, old loyalties. The Macedonians whispered. The Persians watched. In his attempt to become all things to all people, he was becoming isolated, a man no longer at home in the world he had made. And then, one night in June 323 BC, he fell ill. Fever, pain, confusion. He lay in a dark room, his great body trembling, his breath growing shallower by the hour. For days he drifted between sleep and delirium, and around him the silence of dread. They asked him, his generals, his friends, "To whom do you leave the empire?" He whispered it, one short sentence, "To the strongest." Then nothing. Alexander was dead, not yet 33 years old. The world stopped. His generals tore at their tunics. His soldiers wept in the streets. Some refused to eat. Others fell to their knees. The man who had never lost a battle, who had crossed deserts, rivers, empires, was gone. And with him, the dream. The empire fragmented almost immediately. His body, en route to Macedon, was hijacked and rerouted to Egypt, embalmed, entombed. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up the map. Kingdoms rose, fell, and warred for decades. His son, a child named Alexander IV, was murdered before reaching manhood. There would be no dynasty, but the idea of Alexander, that never died. The cities he founded, over 20 of them named Alexandria, became centres of trade, learning, and culture. The fusion of Greek and Eastern worlds, language, religion, philosophy, gave birth to the Hellenistic age. 1,000 years later, Roman emperors still traced his steps. Napoleon slept with a copy of Arrian's Anabasis under his pillow. Even in the trenches of the First World War, young men studied his campaigns, because Alexander wasn't just a man, he was myth, wearing flesh. But there's one more thing. Gaugamela, that dusty plain, now silent, forgotten, was not just where Persia fell. It was where the torch of power passed from east to west, where old gods were dethroned and new ones forged in blood and belief, where the fate of continents shifted in a single day, and where a boy from Macedonia became immortal. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.